question we're doing with everybody is why do you want this job, and why are you the best candidate and not the others?
Sure. First, thank you all for having me here today. Look, I didn't wake up in the morning one day and decide that I wanted to be a member of Congress. I felt that it came from an absolute sense of urgency. I had to run for this seat because each and every day I listen to the stories of Central Texans and the clinic that I work at. As many of you all know, I lead a community health center here where we see 18,000 uninsured and underinsured Central Texans. And when you're in those exam rooms and you're hearing the stories of your neighbors, of your families, stories of profound resilience in the face of trauma, you feel this moral sense of obligation to step forward. And so that's what we decided to do. Now look, I've spent my entire life in public service. 15 years ago, I was a Fulbright scholar working in one of the world's largest landfills on access to clean water. Worked to organize there on access to clean water before labor. And I've continued that fight. I pivoted from background in economics and international studies to public health and medicine. And in 2012, right after Sandy Hook, started a group in New Orleans called Doctors Against Gun Violence, and crisscross states, speaking for the need for a public health approach to gun violence. Continued this fight back home in Texas, and in 2018 led one of the country's largest rallies of doctors and scientists at the border in Tornillo to stand for those children. And so for me, last March, the assessment I came to was that as a father of 3 kids, as a son of immigrants, as a primary care physician to the uninsured, we had to step forward and talk about decency and dignity, science and truth in the face of ideology. So that's the campaign of conviction we've been running. Now look, as it relates to my 2 opponents, any one of us are going to be better than Representative McCaul. But I am running the progressive campaign that can win. And I think that's really important to say. This campaign has raised the same amount of resources, if not more, than any of the candidates here. So we're able to raise the money that we need to be able to build the organization, while at the same time, we're able to actually build a field campaign because we are animating the hearts and minds of volunteers all across the district. We have hundreds of volunteers. We knocked on just 1,000 doors last weekend alone. And so we have support coming from 49 states for this campaign. And so we're building both a vibrant field operation while running a congressional campaign that can defeat Mike McCaul. And Mike McCaul knows it. A couple of months ago, he paid a visit to my health center purely to intimidate. There are hundreds of clinics and hospitals in this district, and we're not going to be intimidated in this race because our politics of pragmatism, rooted in progressivism, rooted in science and truth and decency and dignity, is resonating with the American people. We're not running an ideological campaign. We're running a campaign to move the ball forward, and the American people are ready for that. And that's our case to win this race.
Okay. We'll reset the clock.
Again, I'm Shannon Hutcheson. Thank you so much for having me here today. I got into this race because Congressman McCaul is not fighting for families like the one that I grew up in. And he's darn sure not fighting for women. You know, I am a 4th generation Texan. I grew up in a working poor family, the oldest of 6 kids. After my parents split, my mom worked full time and went to school, leaving me with my 5 younger siblings for a number of years. I figured out early on that education was going to be the key to a better life for me and for my family. I was able to get that education. I moved here to Austin in 1993 to go to the University of Texas Law School, where I graduated at the top of my class. You know, yes, mine is a story of hard work, but it is also a story of the investment that this community made in my family, whether that was free lunches, or it was housing assistance, or it was scholarships and grants. I am sitting here today because of that investment. I've been driving back and forth across this district long before I got in this race. My brother, and his family live in Western Harris County. This district is, and the people of this district, I view as my friends, as my family. one of the things that I hear when I talk to people in this community is that we are not investing in them. We are not investing in health care. We are a state that has failed to expand Medicaid, as you all know. We are not investing in education. We're not investing in providing economic opportunities for folks, particularly in the middle of this district. About 10 years ago, I started a woman-owned law firm here in Austin. Through that firm, I have done a lot of work in the community, fighting against violence on the ground with the Austin Children's Shelter and Safe Alliance. And for the last almost 10 years, I have been representing Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas as a lawyer. That is a fight that is personal to me. When I moved here in '93, before I went to law school, I had no money and I had no insurance. And Planned Parenthood was there for me. And that is a fight that I take very seriously. I look across this district and there are women and families who need a voice. They need someone who will be pragmatic and practical, and that is the approach I am bringing to this race. And by building that coalition, we're going to defeat Congressman McCaul.
Good morning, y'all. Mike Siegel, Democrat for Congress, running to replace Michael McCaul. And for 21 years, I've been a public servant, first as a public school teacher, more recently as a civil rights lawyer and a city attorney for the city of Austin. And I'm running for Congress to fight for the needs of the people of this district and to provide real representation. I ran in 2018, inspired by the fact that McCaul was a co-author of the Muslim ban and was supporting these hateful attacks on our immigrant communities here in Texas, and that he was voting to cut the Affordable Care Act time and time again while refusing to meet with the people of the city here, the people of the Texas 10th. Michael McCaul has not held a public event or a town hall in 11 years. He refuses to show up and engage with the people that he's supposed to represent. And in my background as a public school teacher, as a teachers union organizer, as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, I felt like I could bring something to the table, build a coalition to hold Michael McCaul accountable. And last cycle, nobody thought I had a chance in heck of winning, frankly. People would say, hey, you seem like a nice guy, but I'm going to send my resources elsewhere. But we built a campaign that mobilized 1,000 volunteers and that lowered McCaul's advantage from 19% to 4%, turning a safe Republican seat into what is now a national battleground district. And I'm running again to finish the job, and I think the way we win is not by trying to outspend Michael McCaul. This is a man who's worth $300 million. He has all the resources in the world. But we take advantage of the fact that he has refused to show up for the people. We have major needs in this district, in the Texas 10th. We have tens of thousands of people with no health care at all. We've lost 3 rural hospitals in 10 years. We have a coal plant out in Fayette that's polluting the aquifer underlying dozens of Texas counties. On the Houston side, there's inadequate flood infrastructure. You know, the post-Harvey relief only got them back to square one, hasn't really addressed the deep needs. And so there's lack of rural internet, there's other issues that McCaul has failed to step up and fight back. And so what my campaign has been about is showing up in all these counties, in places where Democrats haven't campaigned actively in decades, and showing folks that we will fight for them. I made national news in 2018, standing up for the students at Prairie View A&M University, when those students were told they couldn't vote on campus on the eve of the voter registration deadline. We showed up, sent a letter, my staffer got arrested while delivering this letter, you may have seen the news. But by appearing on the Rachel Maddow show and shining a light on that issue, we were able to win for the students the right to vote on campus. And my campaign this cycle has been similar, focusing on opposing David Whitley as Secretary of State, showing up to fight this coal plant that's polluting the air and water, representing people by suing the Secretary of State to stop the ban on mobile voting locations. And I feel like by showing up for Democrats, we're able to build a broad coalition. And, you know, big picture, my campaign is best positioned to win the primary. We've won every competitive local endorsement so far in this race because I'm showing up for folks and fighting for them. After I win the nomination, we can consolidate the Democratic coalition and go on and beat McCaul.
We'll start with you on this one and go the other direction. You touched on your travels in the district, which is far-flung and includes rural and urban. And I wondered what, as you travel the district, What are the hot button issues that people are talking about? And be specific if you can.
And how much time?
3 minutes.
Okay. So as you suggested, the Texas 10th as a gerrymandered district includes diverse communities. And really, I would say it has 3 very distinct regions. We've got the Travis County, blueberry and the tomato soup. We've got 7 rural counties between Bastrop and Waller. And then we have the Harris County suburbs. And these are really different cultural regions with different needs. I think the overarching issue is the lack of health care. Folks here in Austin want to talk more about the policy distinctions between Medicare for all and the public option and the different programs being discussed by the presidential nominees. Whereas in Bastrop or LaGrange or Brenham, they're more concerned about the closing hospitals and what we can do to keep those hospitals open. But what I've been talking about is how a universal health care program like Medicare for all can address the fact that folks are facing bankruptcy because of lack of health care, lack of coverage, can address the closing rural hospitals, which are closing in part because of the refusal to expand Medicaid, and can really guarantee that we lift everybody up and guarantee health care. There are other specific issues. Infrastructure is a big one. In the rural areas, lack of high-speed internet is a big issue. There's folks in Bastrop and Waller counties, for example, that are kind of on the edges of these major metropolises. They would prefer to work from home, to run at-home businesses, but they don't have reliable internet. And so I think we need to have something akin to the Rural Electrification Act, which brought electricity to every Texas county almost 100 years ago. We need a similar effort to invest in rural broadband internet. Infrastructure on the Houston side means flood control facilities. That's a big issue. And I will say that the environment is a very important issue, especially among the young people. I am the candidate who's received the environmental endorsements so far, including from the Sunrise Movement, which is taking a major role in fighting climate change. But it also affects the labor movement. And this past weekend, I was at the Texas AFL-CIO convention, where I did earn the endorsement of labor unions for my campaign, despite the fact that this district includes a whole bunch of fossil fuel workers in the Houston region. And it took 3 days of caucusing to work through that, because the words Green New Deal really scare those folks. Because if you talk to a coal worker, they've faced energy deregulation in Texas, they face closing plants, and then they've got this policy proposal that's threatening to take their job. They feel like they're under attack. But at the same time, they know we need clean air and clean water. And so what I'm really trying to do is build a broad coalition to confront climate change, also take care of workers, and really talk about rebuilding the American infrastructure to build a sustainable economy. And that's a very important issue. In places like Ellinger, which might just be a stop on the way to Houston for most of us, that when they get their water bill, they get a list of 1.5 pages of chemicals, largely fracking fluids, that are in their water supply. So water pollution is a big issue in this district. And so by me taking the lead on these environmental issues, I'm standing up for a lot of those folks as well.
As I travel across this district, I try to make it across the district at least once a week, if once every other week. And it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're in Austin or LaGrange or Hempstead or in Western Harris County. Everyone is talking about healthcare. That is by far the number one issue that we are hearing about. And, as Democrats, we share the important value that everyone deserves to be able to access affordable and quality health care. The question is, how do we get there? And what is the timeline for getting there? Through my law practice, I have spent the last almost 24 years, looking at a dispute, looking at an issue. And to me, the best way we approach healthcare or any other issue is saying, where is the common ground from which we can negotiate? Because at the end of the day, this is going to be a negotiated solution. And, to me, the way that we get there is we have to shore up the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act made huge advancements, provided protections for folks with pre-existing conditions. Those of us who are older remember a time when you left one insurance plan and you couldn't get coverage for the very thing you needed coverage for. We will not go back to that. Just here recently, we look at H.R. 3 that Congress passed out. Congressman McCaul, of course, voted against that. That bill would have allowed Medicare to negotiate drug prices. We are the only nation of our kind that doesn't permit that negotiation. We have seen it work with the VA's ability to negotiate drug prices, and we should be doing that across the board. My mother lives on a fixed income and has medications that Medicare doesn't pay for. And one of them is extraordinarily expensive. It's $800 a month. And, but for having children who can help her, she wouldn't be able to access that medication. We need to make sure that we have a public option that covers everyone who needs it, and we need to allow folks who like their plan to be able to keep it.
So there are distinctions, I think, between the three of us on how we view healthcare. Healthcare by far is a universal issue in this district. And of course, I'm biased. I'm a doctor at a free health clinic where we see 18,000 uninsured and underinsured Central Texans. The distinction is this. I am with intention still working during this campaign. Once a week, I see patients on Mondays. And when I'm in clinic, seeing patients from the rural parts of this district and the urban parts of this district, if you could come into my exam rooms with me and have to see a young child who can't get access to medication for rheumatoid arthritis, or be sitting next to a patient and literally be Googling to try to find cheaper insulin because we can't find the right kind of insulin, or what happened to me last Monday in clinic, screaming at an insurance company because they refused to fill the drug that I had prescribed for my patient, it is broken. And people are broken because of it. But the distinction is this. I believe in universal health care. Every single person should have access to health insurance, should get coverage. What I worry about is that we're going to put people in Washington who are going to have the same ideological debates from day one. We have polar opposites in Washington, Democrats, Republicans on the furthest extremes, who are willing to have these debates on Medicare for all versus Medicare for none versus Affordable Care Act, when the American people are suffering. And we have to be able to compromise. When did compromise become a bad word? And so for me, what we need to do is, yes, put forth a public option to cover every single person that's uninsured and underinsured in this country. We need to be able to negotiate the federal government to lower drug prices. We auto-enroll every single person in Medicare who's a newborn, born into this country. And there's a distinction there that's called an extensive public choice plan. And that's the way we move forward, because we don't waste time having ideological debates in Washington. But healthcare is just one of a couple of issues in this district. In the rural parts of this district, I was in Belleville not too long ago. I was talking with a gentleman who owns a business there, and he was telling me that the price of horseshoes had gone up by $3, the price of cow pens had gone up by $900. And we had this long conversation because I have this background in economics. We were talking about it, and guess what? It was the tariff on metal that had caused those prices to increase. Now, this is a gentleman that's now having a hard time competing because the business down the road had stockpiled horseshoes, and they were able to compete, and he wasn't able to. And so people are genuinely worried about their jobs. They're worried about putting food on the table in the middle parts of the district, and they are feeling the effect of Trump's policies, economic policies and social policies, and that matters, and it resonates for the rural parts of the district. Now, in both the urban areas of the district, people who have historically not had a seat at these tables are feeling the effects of decades of mismanagement as it comes to social and economic policy. Why in Austin, if you're a black child or a Hispanic child, you have a 3 times higher rate of being food insecure than if you're a white child or Asian child? Why is that very similar in Houston? So there are issues of race and ethnicity in this district, healthcare and economic policy that we're hearing door to door in every part of this district.
All of you touched on healthcare as one of the major concerns, and that was actually one of the questions we had
Sure.
on your policies. Did you all want more time to sort of be specific about your policies, or we can move on?
Or can I ask it this way?
Yeah.
I think you sort of got to it here. If so, we're having the same debate in the presidential race,
Sure.
and we have all the Medicare for all and Medicare for
Yeah.
all who want it, and so if you could align your favored plan with
Yeah.
one of the presidential candidates' plans, what would it be?
Yeah, I guess I'll start.
Just to make sure.
I haven't heard a presidential candidate talk specifically about the plan that I mentioned. Some folks call it as Medicare Extra, but essentially what it is that every child born in our country, newborn, will be auto-enrolled on Medicare. Over the age of 65, auto-enrolled, everyone on the exchange plans, everyone that's uninsured and underinsured, auto-enrolled, and those that cannot afford their copays and deductibles have the option of getting on to that plan. It is what objective analyses call the most exhaustive public option plan available that is not Medicare for all. The distinction between that exhaustive public option plan, again, I haven't heard a presidential candidate talk about it yet, the distinction between that and Medicare for all is just one thing, which is the government will not legislate out private payers. There is no love lost between me and private payers, none. I fight them every single week in my clinic on behalf of my patients. But there is a difference on how I view American capitalism. I believe in moral capitalism. But moral capitalism still means that I believe in capitalism, and I don't think the government should be in the business of dictating what private companies are a part or not a part of our system. I think that they'll be likely unable to compete. I think they won't be able to compete with a public plan. They'll have to leave the market. But let the market decide that. And so that's my general perspective on policy. As it relates to drug reform, I think most Democrats are in line with H.R. 3. Believe that that's a really innovative way to be able to lower the price of prescription drugs. But any conversation about healthcare reform has to put political, social, and legal determinants of health on the table. If we're talking about healthcare reform, and in the same breath, we're not talking about the fact that if you're a black woman in this state and you're having a child, your chance of maternal mortality is significantly higher than if you're a white woman in this state, then we're making a mistake. And if we're having a conversation about access to inhalers for asthma, but we're not talking about the fact that if you're poor in this district and you're living in a home that has mold in it and your landlord's not fixing that mold, we're making a mistake. And if we're talking about long-term health outcomes, but we're not talking about access to early childhood education, because what we know is that if you have high-quality early childhood education from age 0 to 5, even if you're mainstreamed to public school after age 5, your outcomes by the time you're 20 and 30 years old are much better. If we're not talking about that in the same breath as healthcare reform, we're making a mistake. And so we need to be able to talk about a health in all policies approach when we talk about healthcare reform. And I haven't heard presidential candidates talk about that, and we have to. And so I would submit that this exhaustive public choice option is Avenue 1, and then having a robust conversation around social, racial, legal, and political determinants of health is option number 2.
You know, for the last number of years, Congressman McCaul has been voting against the Affordable Care Act at every opportunity. He has been voting to defund Planned Parenthood. To me, the best way to ensure that everyone among us has the coverage that they deserve, coverage that they can afford, is to create a public option. A public option that is subsidized in a way that it is affordable. I've spent a lot of time talking with folks in this district, and believe it or not, there are people out there who like the plan they have. A large component of folks that I have heard express that view are folks in labor unions. What I hear from them is this is part of what we bargained for. And we agree with you. Everyone needs care. Everyone should be able to access it and afford it, but don't take our plan away. I think that it is important, part of what we hear about Medicare for All is that, and single payer, is that it sort of accelerates this process. It eliminates insurance companies from the marketplace, and it's essentially the government dictating that happening on a very specific timeline. To me, I think that if we are able to do what we believe we are able to do, and that is provide a public option that does in fact improve access, improves affordability, and improves quality, then at the end of the day, we're all going to end up on that plan. And when we do, insurance companies will no longer be able to compete in this marketplace. And I think that an additional benefit of that is that it allows the economy to adapt. There are some 2.5 million people who work in the insurance industry, and we need an opportunity for our economy to adjust to this new option. And at the end of the day, we may all be on this public plan. I just want to make absolutely sure that whatever we do doesn't make the problem worse, because we have an obligation to everyone, particularly the most vulnerable among us, to ensure that we make this situation better and we improve quality, affordability, and accessibility.
So you can see I'm the Medicare for All guy here, and I'll make the case. I support the Sanders and Jayapal bills in the House, and I believe that health care should be universal, should be comprehensive, so that it should be free at the point of service with no copays, no deductibles, no premiums. That every person that should have the right to choose their doctor, to choose their hospital, and choose their specialist. And that these other programs that are on the table here will leave people behind. Medicare for All is the only program that will guarantee health care to the 29 million people without coverage and to the tens of millions more who are facing bankruptcy in the event of a medical crisis. And that it's the only program that will guarantee the right to an abortion to every woman or prospective mother in this country. And that it will lift millions of people out of poverty, because poor, Black, Latino folks are some of the most at-risk folks for lacking access to health care. And so when you have a universal program like this, it will support social justice and equality. Big picture, I come at this as a former public school teacher, and I've seen how the privatization of public education has hurt public school districts. Even if you have a wonderful charter school or a couple charter schools, as a system, when you have many charter schools, they are weakening the public school districts and leaving in those districts the most disadvantaged students, the English language learners, the special needs kids, the folks who cost more to educate. And if we have a two-tier system with a Medicare for all who want it, and then this private insurance, what that's going to mean is the folks who have more privilege or maybe lower healthcare costs are going to choose private insurance, and that's going to make sure that the Medicare system is less successful. The only way you achieve the cost savings to cover everyone in America is by having a single payer system. That's how you reduce the administrative costs. That's how you reduce the drug costs. That's how you get the money that's currently going to corporate CEOs and corporate dividends and so forth, profits. You need to redirect those funds towards patient care. And so I do believe that, like prisons, I don't think we should have private prisons. I think we should have strong public education. I think we should have strong public health programs. I also want to address the idea that this is ideological. Actually, I think as Democrats, we need to be fighting for everyone. And my job as a candidate, I'm not going to be Speaker of the House in 2021, even if I do wonderfully well in this campaign. So I'm not going to set the agenda. But it's my job to signal to every Democrat out there, including I think the 2/3 or more of Democrats who support Medicare for All, that I'm going to be there fighting for them. I'm not going to compromise before we get to the bargaining table. Similar to the Green New Deal, we need to come out with bold demands. And then, yes, we're going to go make the sausage in Congress. But we need to signal that we're going to fight for everyone. We're going to keep your hospital open. We're going to keep you out of bankruptcy. And we're going to guarantee your health care.
So, gerrymander district, obviously. Yet the last election was far closer than anybody imagined, as you know. What about your agenda specifically do you think will resonate with the majority of voters in this gerrymandered district? And we'll go the other way, start with you.
You know, I think the most important thing that I've demonstrated is that I'm going to show up and listen to folks. You know, when I started campaigning in 2018, my first block walk was in LaGrange, and folks would tell me they hadn't seen a Democrat in 40 years. I would go to Brenham to meet with the Democratic Club. I got a round of applause when I walked in the room to have lunch with 40 people. I had to look over my shoulder to see if Beto was coming in behind me. I mean, Democrats have not actively campaigned in this district until the last cycle. And what I did last cycle was show that it's possible to win. You know, for a long time throughout my campaign, I faced this viability question. And it's self-perpetuating, right? I won the nomination, would call donors, they would say, oh, MJ Hager or someone else has a better chance, I'm going to send my resources elsewhere. I even earned the union endorsements, but when it comes to send troops at the end of the campaign, they would say, you know what, Mike, we really like you, but we're going to send our resources to these other races that are perceived to be more winnable. But so now this is considered to be a winnable race by dint of the hard work of the thousands of volunteers from my campaign, for Beto's campaigns and others, who did that hard work of meeting the people. And so big picture, showing up, being accessible, accountable, that's step one, because that's the distinction with McCaul. He's taking the vast majority of his money from corporate PACs. He's not meeting the people. He's not listening to folks' concerns. And then from there, it's fighting for the safety net, making sure everyone has the opportunity to succeed. That means healthcare. That means strong public schools. That means clean air and clean water. That means fighting for good jobs, fighting for a living wage. It's really it's fighting on the Democratic platform. Last cycle, the reason I didn't beat McCaul, even though Beto basically beat Ted Cruz in the district by a fraction of a percentage point, is not because my policies were different than Beto's. Beto supported Medicare for All in his campaign last cycle. But it's because I didn't have the resources that he did. But now national attention is on this race. That's demonstrated by the fact that multiple national organizations have already endorsed me this cycle, and I think a few more are to come, because people see this as a very winnable race. It's a swing district. And on both ends of the district, in the general election, we're going to have folks from Austin and Houston coming in to help, because this is the next seat we can win. You know, last cycle it might have been Lizzie Pennell Fletcher in the Texas 7th, but this cycle, the Texas 10th, is next up. And because Michael McCaul has co-signed on some of the worst abuses of the Trump administration, co-authored the Muslim ban, supported the government shutdown for a border wall, you name it, McCaul has co-signed to whatever Trump has want to do, even going so far as to actively defend him in this impeachment process, even though Trump has clearly abused the power of his office. McCaul will be very vulnerable. And I think the way we're going to win is by building a massive movement that's going to go out across this district, knock on hundreds of thousands of doors, and let folks know that Democrats will fight for them.
You know, as I talk to people in this district, my story connects me with people, whether they're in LaGrange or in Katy or in Bastrop. I've lived an American dream. I was able to succeed because of hard work, but also because our community invested in me. We have to get back to a place where we are investing in people, in our children, in the most vulnerable among us. The way we win this seat, this cycle, is mobilizing women, mobilizing people of color. This district has seen the largest growth in the population of people of color, of voting age, more so than any other district in the state, according to information released by the party since 2010. We see that in this community. We see it across the district. This district is heavily female. We also see that, particularly in the primary, but also in the general. Last cycle, Mike McCaul was asleep. He had no idea that he had a fight on his hands. The cycle before, he won by 19 points. Mike McCaul is no longer asleep. And so the question is, how are we going to beat him? Absolutely, we have to be organizing. We have to be on the ground. We have to be making the phone calls and the texts. But we also have to be building these broader coalitions where we can raise the resources to communicate. We have to be able to communicate at a commensurate level with McCaul. We have to be able to educate voters in this district, which has never happened before, about Mike McCaul's voting history. Votes against the Affordable Care Act. He voted against background checks last year. He voted to defund Planned Parenthood. He votes against equality. These are issues that not just Democrats care about. There are a lot of swing voters, particularly women, and that is the path to victory in an R+9 district. We have to do what Lizzie Fletcher did in Houston in the district that abuts this one to the east, which is turn out those women, turn out women who may have voted for a Republican in the past, but they don't recognize this party. This party doesn't speak for them. That is how we win. And by educating folks and by being present and by talking about the issues that keep people up at night. Mike McCaul a few weeks ago sent out an email, his top 3 issues in this district: border security, ending childhood cancer, and human trafficking. Well, for crying out loud, I mean, who is for human trafficking or childhood cancer? Those are not political issues. And those are not the issues we're hearing about across this district when we talk to people. And that's what we have to do. We have to talk about the things that keep them up at night.
We win the district by giving a damn. That's the bottom line. We win the district by being authentic. And authenticity is what folks crave. Now look, in terms of the progressive voters in Travis County and some of the progressive voters in Harris County, I think this campaign has a long history that we can point voters to. They've seen me on MSNBC fighting for folks at the border. They've seen me at the Capitol fighting for choice. On the day that those bans went through in the Gulf South, I was behind a mic fighting hard for Planned Parenthood and others. They've seen me fight against drug companies a decade ago. And so a lifetime of fighting the progressive fights is going to galvanize the progressive voters in Travis County. But guess what? When I'm at my clinic, I don't see Democratic sore throats and Republican sore throats. I see people. And I know a lot about what it means to be authentic. I spent the first, 15 years of my life with a severe stutter. I couldn't say anything. My father took a couple of jobs to be able to pay for me to go to speech therapy. And you learn to have conversations with people without saying anything at all. And I told myself that if I found my voice, I'd spend the rest of my life fighting for people that don't have it. And I think that's what we've been able to talk about with the conservative voters in the middle part of the district. We need to win those voters. And we don't win those voters by having ideological debates. And I would push back here a little bit. When we're talking about public schools and we denigrate charter schools, I have my patients of mine, my black and brown patients, they don't have 5 and 10 years to wait for their public school to get better. Almost all of my patients go to charter schools. And they go to charter schools because that's where they feel they can get the care that they need and the education they need for their kids. Now, I believe in strong public schools, but I'm not going to hold progress hostage and their education hostage because of it. I believe every single person should have universal coverage, but I'm not willing to go to Washington and wait 3 years to get universal health care while people are suffering. That's why I believe in compromising to be able to help people today, and this message is resonating all across this district. That's why in Harris County, we're speaking to voters in their own language. That's why we have marshaled one of the largest field plans and programs of any candidate in this race, while at the same time raising the money and the resources to communicate. And that's how this campaign is different, because we have the resources and we've raised the money that Shannon's campaign has raised. Yet at the same time, we've built the field campaign and the organizing campaign that Mike's campaign has done. And we've done it because we're talking about people and their issues over and over and over. And I think that's the way that we get into the hearts and minds of people in this district. People are tired of politicians. They want people who are professionals who know how to solve problems. And I'm a professional who knows how to solve problems. That's my job. I look at things from a public health perspective. I was born right outside the district. I think I'm the only candidate that lives in this district, works in this district, and was born right outside this district. And so this message is resonating with people, and we're able to do both. Raise the resources to communicate, build the field campaign to be able to organize and win.
Anyone have questions?
Does anyone else want to respond to what you're saying is that the other candidates may not live in this district. Do you guys want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. This district was, has been around since the late 1800s. My house was right in the heart of that district until Tom DeLay came in and chopped up Travis County into 5 different districts. Now it's interesting. If you look at 38th and Guadalupe and 28th and Guadalupe, 10 block straight line, touches 3 United States congressional districts. That is, the ultimate in voter suppression. And that's why, of course, this is an extraordinarily important election year for purposes of redrawing these districts for the next 10 years. I live 34th Street, so I'm about 4 blocks south of this imaginary line that Tom DeLay drew. Again, I moved here in 1993. This district is home to my family, and do my grocery shopping in the district. This is our community, and I've yet to hear anyone express any concern about the fact that I live 4 blocks south of this line when we're out there talking about the issues that are important to people.
I live in the district. I live in the Crestview neighborhood of North Austin, and just to respond to the point about who's knocking doors, I mean, you make a choice when you run for Congress about how you're going to spend your time. We all have extremely limited time. And I've made a choice to focus on movement building more than call time. And that's why my campaign has been able to mobilize hundreds of volunteers. We've knocked 25,000 doors in this Travis County alone. And if any of y'all come up to North Central Austin, you'll see our signs, because we've mobilized people. And so I might not have as much money in the bank account, but you can't quantify the value of people who are willing to spend their hours working for you. And that's a strategic choice I made for the primary. I do know that in the general, we're going to have to raise big money to beat McCaul. I was lucky enough to have donations from Dr. Gandhi and Shannon before they decided to run against me. And I think that a lot of their supporters will support me in the general. But first thing first, someone's got to win this primary. And so for me, the path to victory in a district where historically 2/3 of the voters are in Travis County, I've focused on a field program and mobilizing volunteers here. And we'll see how that works out.
Anybody else?
Let me ask you about border security here, as being one of McCaul's issues. So what is, I'm going to assume, why don't you tell me, what is your answer for border security? What do you think of a wall? What do you think of the state of our immigration? What would you actually do to improve that situation?
Sure. This issue is deeply personal. It's one of the reasons why I decided to run for Congress. Many of my patients are undocumented. There's one woman in particular I talk about who is a DACA recipient. Her husband is undocumented. Every morning at 4 a.m, they wake their 3 kids up, they get in a circle, and they say their prayers, and they hug each other because they're not sure if today's going to be the day that one of them is going to be deported. The trauma that I hear in my exam rooms, these are the trauma of Central Texans, is so great that we are devastating an entire generation of children in our country. We're devastating them. And the trauma knows no bounds in terms of the long-term implications on their health and their well-being. And so it is a moral imperative for this country to do right by our dreamers, to have a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented people and families in our country. And those are priorities. On top of that, though, politicians don't play the long game. Never. Whether it relates to health or education. It's why we don't invest in early childhood education, even though there's been a Nobel Prize won for that work. The Heckman studies and Perry Preschool and Abecedarian studies are fantastic to look at. Huge return on investment. And so for me, the long term is that we know that we have geopolitical instability in countries south of our border. no wall, no lasers, is going to make any difference at all. The women that I see in my clinic and their families don't travel across deserts and deal with coyotes and a whole host of other issues because they want to. They do it because they have to, because they feel that it is an obligation to their family for a better life. I would call for a massive investment in countries south of our border and partnership, hand in hand, with the social safety net of those countries to improve and increase the stability of the political institutions. Castro has called for former presidential candidate Castro called for a post-World War II Marshall Plan investment. I think that makes sense because that's the long game. The long game here is that you've got to improve the partnerships between the United States and countries south of our border. You've got to stabilize the political institutions. You've got to stabilize the social institutions to prevent migration in the first place. So that's the long play. I don't think a border wall is going to be effective at all. There's no study to me that demonstrates that it's effective. We've got to have a pathway of citizenship. We've got to do right by our dreamers. And then we've got to have a humane policy on our walls. I mean, the reality is this at our borders is that we stopped doing a community program, community case management, even though there was last time I checked this study, and correct me if I'm wrong, a 99.2% rate of those families actually showing up for their court dates. But we stopped doing it. And we reverted to putting families together in cages at our border. And so we've got to do what the evidence says to do. And so that's why I would be in favor of those kinds of programs as well. At the end of the day, I'm a scientist. That's why the country's largest organization to elect scientists have elected me, have endorsed me. And so that's where the evidence is on that. We've got to get back to that kind of family case management at our borders.
You know, as a mom, I think that we have to inject humanity back in these discussions. We have to stop dividing people by race. You know, it is part and parcel of this message that is coming from the top. It's yet another reason that this election is so critical. You know, Congress failed us. They failed us by not passing comprehensive immigration reform years ago. And that is part and parcel of why we are in this state. It also is due to this sort of nationalism, if you will, and we are not investing in our hemisphere like we were. Every one of us, I'm sure, knows a dreamer or dreamers. We have a close family friend who is a dreamer. And, you know, I think about, you know, he came here as a very young child. He's now 21, almost 22. We made promises to him, to his mother. We have invested in him, and he's invested in us. And now he is a tax-paying, hard-working young man, and he's somebody that we should embrace in our community. And we have to ensure that he has a path to citizenship. Temporary workers who are here performing critical labor, we need to make sure that there is a path to citizenship. You know, I am, as the wife of a retired Marine, I am deeply offended that this president is pilfering military funds to build a medieval wall across the border. There's no evidence that would make any difference whatsoever, other than an environmental detriment, other than we are going to condemn land that belongs to Texans, that is going to create an artificial barrier between Texas and its largest trading partner. In 2018, we exported almost $110 billion in goods to Mexico. We need to have thoughtful solutions, and that starts with comprehensive immigration reform.
So I come to this conversation with kind of two basic values. One, that families belong together and human beings should be treated with respect and dignity. And I think if we embrace those values again as a nation, a lot of good things would come from just starting from those 2 points. You know, if families belong together, then we won't be separating children from their mothers and fathers at the border. We won't be treating people who seek asylum as criminals. We're going to evaluate their claims, allow them to remain here while their claims are adjudicated, and give them basic dignity and respect. We need to obviously accomplish comprehensive immigration reform, something that was on the agenda before the Tea Party movement, and basically in their hateful invective towards Obama, knocked it off the agenda. And that's just common sense. I mean, Democrats and Republicans were ready for that. Texas is ready for that. Think of all the Texas Republican business people who depend upon immigrant labor and are suffering under these ridiculously hateful and divisive policies. You know, before I ran for Congress, I think the most important thing I did here in Texas was serving as the lead attorney for the city of Austin in the fight against Senate Bill 4, which was a fight against a hateful anti-immigrant law that was a show me your papers law, and actually showed what was possible in Texas when we organize. You know, that was the first time that not just Austin, but San Antonio, El Paso, Houston, Dallas, all joined together to sue the Texas governor. That hadn't happened before. This is before Beto ran for Senate and showed what might be possible for Democrats in Texas. But through that work on that case, I learned how students were scared from going to school during immigration raids and the announcement of SB 4. People missed healthcare appointments. Our economic activity and tourism suffered. I mean, these policies that the Republicans are pursuing to appeal to maybe their most hateful base are bad for our economy, bad for our society, bad for public safety. You know, Chief Manley will tell you that people are less likely to cooperate with the police, even if they're a victim of crime or a witness to crime, because they're scared of having immigration agents involved in the investigation. And so we really need to put forward a humanitarian policy. I agree that we do need to invest in Central and South America. The idea that our current administration has put diplomacy on the back burner is harmful to all of us. We need to build an international movement to stabilize some of these countries, especially in the Northern Triangle. We need to invest in civil society. We need to give folks a reason to stay because obviously these folks are so desperate that they're willing to cross long distances just to come here for opportunity. So big picture, we need to get back to the table on comprehensive immigration reform. I'm not confident we're going to get there until Donald Trump and maybe Mitch McConnell are removed from office, but that's what's going to be the best thing for Texas and the country.
Talk about your positions on gun reform, and I'm wondering what you're hearing from rural voters on that topic. We'll start and go this way.
So I support comprehensive, common sense gun reforms, things that are supported by the vast majority of Americans and Texans, like universal background checks, red flag laws. I also support stopping the sale of weapons of war. You know, these assault rifles that can kill huge numbers of people in a very short amount of time and have nothing to do with defending your home or recreational shooting activities. I also support comprehensive campaign finance reform because I think what's happened is that the influence of money from the gun manufacturers through the National Rifle Association has polluted our political process and actually disenfranchised voters. You know, Senator John McCain, rest in peace, this is a guy who received millions upon millions of dollars from the NRA during his political career. And that's money that outweighs the voice of ordinary voters who actually elect this guy to the United States Senate. And so the idea that the NRA is able to disenfranchise voters by funneling millions upon millions of dollars in corporate money to essentially buy elected officials is bad for democracy. What I hear from voters is that they support these more common sense measures. But at the same time, you know, when I gave a talk in Brenham not so long ago, they say, Mike, we really like a lot of what you're talking about, but don't talk about guns or abortion out here, you know? But at the same time, a couple women chimed in right after that. No, we like that he talks about that. But I do get some pushback on the gun issues. Definitely there was some concern about the idea of confiscation that you know, Beto O'Rourke introduced into the presidential campaign. I don't think that's an issue that's a winner for Democrats. That's not something that's popular in the rural or even urban counties. And also, it just puts a major stumbling block to saving lives by putting this idea of government coming into your homes before all these common sense things. I mean, all of us accept that if we're going to drive an automobile, we need a driver's license, insurance, we need to maintain our vehicle. Why can't there be a similar regulatory regime for firearms to make sure you know how to use the weapon, that it's registered, and so forth, that you don't have a background of abuse or violence? So these are things that are much easier to talk about, especially if we can connect it to the corruption of our political system. That is something that is offensive for folks of all stripes, Democrats and Republicans. The idea that these corporate interests can basically buy our elected officials so that they don't even pass common sense policies that are supported by the vast number of Americans. And so I do support the bills that have been put out there by the House Speaker Pelosi. I do support reforms to stop the sale of assault rifles, and I think at the same time we need to combat the money in politics piece.
I come at this issue as a mom. I have two daughters. My oldest goes to UT, campus carry. You walk across campus, there are signs that say no smoking anywhere, but you can carry a weapon. It's deeply disturbing. I mean, to me, there's the idea of undeveloped prefrontal cortexes and alcohol and drugs and guns just is a recipe for disaster. I also come at this issue as a lawyer, as a person who deeply respects the Constitution. I also come at this, as I said earlier, my husband is a retired Marine. He grew up on a ranch where his grandfather was a foreman. He grew up in and around guns. We are gun owners. To me, you can marry all these things together. You can have common sense gun legislation that will help make our community safer, and you can do it in a manner that is absolutely consistent with our constitutional rights. As I said earlier, Congressman McCaul voted just this past year against background checks. And, we all know that background checks are extraordinarily popular and have a very wide base of support, even among gun owners that I talk to in this district. And again, as a gun owner, I believe that we absolutely should have background checks. We absolutely should be making sure that we close the gun show loophole. We should make absolutely sure that abusers and perpetrators of domestic violence are unable to access weapons. Through my work for the last 10 years with the Children's Shelter and with SAFE, I have seen over and over and over again the scourge of gun violence up close. We've all seen it as Texans, from Midland, Odessa, El Paso, Sutherland Springs, and White Settlement, and we can go on and on and on. We absolutely have to stop selling weapons of war. The idea that the Constitution somehow provides a protection for the right to own weapons of war is frankly just silly, and we have to maintain some semblance of common sense when we approach these problems. And so again, we have to come back. We have to enact common sense gun reform, and that starts with background checks and stopping the sale of these weapons of war.
So as I mentioned earlier, this issue is very personal to me. As I said, right after Sandy Hook, I started this group in New Orleans, Doctors Against Gun Violence. And I was living in a city that had more murders per capita than any other city in the United States at that time. And I was training as a pediatrician in that city, and you can imagine what we saw. I know where I was the day that a woman brought her son in to our emergency room and screamed at us, pleaded with us to do something. And of course, in that moment, we had to do something for her child, I think there was a bigger ask to do something nationally on this issue. A couple of weeks ago in my clinic, I was taking care of a gentleman that had a gunshot wound. And so, without a question from a policy perspective, I think we're all sort of in the same place, right? Comprehensive background checks, closing the gun show loopholes, banning weapons of war for civilian use, limiting high-capacity magazines, because this is an important part, and I haven't heard this yet, but limiting high-capacity magazines is important when you look at an analysis of what drove all of the major massacres over the last decade. If we just did that one thing, the limitation of high-capacity magazines, we probably could have saved a number of lives, and that's what the evidence would suggest too. And certainly ensuring that the federal government and universities all across the country are able to research, because at the end of the day, this gun violence issue is an epidemic. It's a public health crisis, and we need to be putting our resources towards this public health crisis. So I would treat it from that perspective, from a public health perspective, and marshal the interdisciplinary resources that we need. But it goes beyond that, right? Part of it is the policies, but we fail as a party at pushing these policies because we just talk about policies. What are we doing on messaging? When I'm out in these rural communities, and when I'm talking to patients from these rural areas, I'm not talking about the extreme risk protection orders, because that's what we mean when we talk about red flag laws. I'm actually talking about the fact that, look, your sister who was abused by her husband, do you want him having access to a gun? We're talking about people and their relationships. When we're in Brenham and we're talking about gun violence, and we knocked on 4 straight doors in a row, and I talk about this often in Brenham, and these were not Republican or Democratic doors, these were just doors. And 3 of those doors in a row, gun violence was the #1 issue. We were surprised, blown away so much that I talk about it every one of these things. And so when I'm talking about gun violence there, and I was talking to this woman about her child, she was worried about her child because the school had just gone into a lockdown not that long ago. I talk about the safety of your children in schools, and then link in conversations around measures we can do to prevent gun violence. Because we don't win this race, and we don't win on policies like gun violence if we don't talk about people and their stories. And so that's what we've been able to do during this race. We've got policies, we need to take a public health approach, and we need to elevate the stories in the rural parts of the district.
How are we on time?
We're there.
Really?
Want to ask your voting question?
Who are you voting for president? Anyone made a decision yet?
I've not made a decision yet. I'll tell you that I liked Julian Castro. I've talked about Castro a lot today. He's not in the race anymore. I like Mayor Pete. I like Klobuchar. I'm not sure. Somewhere in that vicinity, probably.
Yeah, I haven't made a decision either. I think, when I go into that voting booth, I'm going to be basing that decision on, who ultimately I decide is going to be best on the issues that I hear about in this district, the issues that are important to people, and that's, healthcare, it's education, and it's economic opportunity. But I will say that, no matter who comes out of this Democratic primary, I hope that all Democrats will rally around that candidate, because this is the election of our lifetime, and you better bet that I will rally around that candidate and do everything I can to ensure that he or she defeats Donald Trump.
Well, as a candidate, I haven't taken a public position on what presidential nominee I'm supporting. But I think the best person for us as the potential Democratic nominee is someone who's really committed to being on the ground here in Texas. And that's something that hasn't been decided yet. I mean, that was one of the exciting things about Beto running for president. Notwithstanding the merits of his overall, nomination or campaign, but the idea that he was so committed to showing up everywhere in Texas, that meant so much to people. And I haven't quite been able to tell yet which of these Democratic candidates is willing to do that here in Texas. I think there's only a couple campaigns. I think it's Bloomberg and Warren who are really on the ground here. And so I'm hopeful that maybe it's after Iowa or the primary after that these folks will really invest here. Because to me, that's what's going to be best for the nominee in the Texas 10th.